The tight turns of Pimlico, the middle jewel of the Triple Crown. It is time for another Preakness Handicapping Show. The Triple Crown 2024. The trail continues, and we go to Old Hilltop in Baltimore for the 2024 Preakness Stakes. We're going to be handicapping the Preakness Stakes tonight, and we're going to take your questions, get to some pace questions, go over all of the contenders of the Preakness Stakes 2024. Remember, it's going to be on Saturday. It is a grade 1, and they'll be going 1 mile and 3/16 at Pimlico. It's a 16th of a mile shorter than the Kentucky Derby, and all of the horses will carry 126 pounds. The Preakness Stakes on Saturday at Pimlico. Now let's take a look. The big news out of Pimlico today was Muth, the morning line favorite for the Preakness Stakes at 8-5. He spiked a fever after shipping from California to Pimlico, and Tuesday night he arrived, and Wednesday morning they announced that Muth had spiked a 103 fever, and he is going to be scratched from the Preakness Stakes. So now we're down to 8 horses, and Mystik Dan most likely becomes the favorite for the Preakness Stakes. We've got Mystik Dan returning from the Preakness Stakes, from the Kentucky Derby to the Preakness Stakes. We've also got Just Steel for Coach D. Wayne Lucas, and then we've got Catching Freedom. So 3 of the Kentucky Derby runners have entered the Preakness Stakes. And then we did have Mugatu, who wasn't also eligible for the Kentucky Derby. He is in the Preakness Stakes. So the post position has been drawn. We did get a field of originally 9 horses, but now we're down to 8 horses for the Preakness Stakes. It's led by Mugatu, number 1. He is going to be 20-1. Uncle Heavy, 20-1 on the morning line. Catching Freedom, originally 6-1. Now Moose was scratched. He was the 8-5 favorite with Juan Hernandez. Brian Hernandez at 5-2 with Mystik Dan. Sees the Gray, one of 2 horses for D. Wayne Lucas. He's 15-1. Just Steel at 15-1. Tuscan Gold at 8-1. And rounding out the field, Frankie Dettori on Imagination in that 9 post position. Now, remember, we'll probably get an updated morning line on Thursday, but so far that has not come out. We're going to be talking about Mystik Dan. We're going to be talking about Imagination. We're going to be talking a little bit about your best bet in the Preakness, all as we take a look at this field. Now, the first thing that I always like to do is make any changes from their most recent start for some of the horses in the race. And the 2 main changes we've got is Irad Ortiz is going to be riding Uncle Heavy here in the Preakness Stakes. And then Joel Rosario is going to be riding Just Steel. And of course, Just Steel was in that pace duel early on in the Derby before fading late. One interesting thing to note is that Joel Rosario did ride Just Steel in the Ed Brown Stakes last year at Churchill Downs. So we've got a question about the DuPont on Friday. We'll maybe get to that a little bit later on as we get to a few of the other races. We're going to focus in early on in the show on the Preakness Stakes, go over all of the contenders, and take a look at some of those other factors for the Preakness Stakes. Now, remember, Bob Baffert with 8 Preakness Stakes winners. He did have the winner last year with National Treasure, defeating Blazing Sevens in a stretch-long duel. That was the 8th Preakness win for trainer Bob Baffert. Now, he still has Imagination in the race, but Imagination is out of the 9th post position on the outside. And it looks like right now, we definitely want to talk about the pace of the race, because with the scratch of Muth, I really believe Imagination goes from maybe possibility of 3 horses being on the lead to possibility of Imagination being the lone speed in this race. The only other horse I really think that wants to go at it early on is maybe Seize the Gray. He won the Pat Day Mile. That was 2 weeks ago. He turns around from Kentucky Derby Day and going to try to stretch it out to a mile and 3/16. So Imagination, possibility of being the lone speed. Now, we do have some new shooters in this race. Of course, from 1976 to 2023, the winner of the Preakness was a Kentucky Derby winner 17 times. Then we had a Kentucky Derby winner, non-winner, 20 times. So horses that ran in the Kentucky Derby that won the Preakness 20 times. And then new shooters, we had 10 new shooters. And of course, one of those new shooters was last year when we had National Treasure, who had ran in the Santa Anita Derby. He came in and won the Preakness. Now, this year, we do have some new shooters. We've got Mugatu. We've also got Uncle Heavy. Then we've also got Tuscan Gold for trainer Chad Brown. And on the outside is Imagination. Now, Imagination, if Bob Baffert wouldn't have been suspended from the Kentucky Derby, Imagination would have had the points to get into the Kentucky Derby because he won the San Felipe, and then he also ran second in the Santa Anita Derby. So I'm not really sure if Imagination qualifies as a new shooter based on the point standings the last couple of years, but he was not in the Kentucky Derby. So by the definition, he will be a new shooter from a horse that did not appear in the Kentucky Derby. Now we're going to take a look at all 9 of the horses in the race, 8 horses now with the scratch of Muth. Just to look at the most recent Preakness Stakes winners, you know, Bob Baffert winning with Looking at Lucky in 2010. You also had Bob Baffert getting it done in 2015 with American Pharoah, and then Justify in 2018, and then Bob Baffert last year with National Treasure. Now, American Pharoah and Justify both won the Triple Crown, and they both won the Kentucky Derby. Looking at Lucky was off the board in the Kentucky Derby because he drew that one post position and had a very rough trip. And then Chad Brown, who's got a horse in this race, and Tuscan Gold, he has 2 winners. In 2017, he won with Cloud Computing, who was a new shooter that year. And then Early Voting was a new shooter a couple of years ago. And then last year, he ran second with Blazing Sevens. So Chad Brown has Tuscan Gold in this year's Preakness Stakes. Now, some other trends that I want to take a look at before we get to the horses here. We do have Mugatu. And when you look at Mugatu overall, he's ran 12 times. He's only got 1 win. And Mugatu, you know, he comes in riding a pretty long losing streak. His last win was in November at Gulfstream Park. He is a closer in the race. And I guess give me some thoughts on Mugatu. And do you think Mugatu is a horse that you could use in this race? So first comment, Bob did comment that he thought Imagination was in good form. All of his works have been with Muth, and he's been keeping up. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, interestingly enough, they've been taking turns, the inside horse and the outside horse, but Muth and Imagination have been working in tandem. And then from some of the other contenders out of Bob Baffert's barn, of course, Nysos getting hurt in February. And then you had My Moon, who came back to defeat Imagination. And then My Moon kind of disappeared from the work tab as well. So I do think you've got some horses that are capable in this race. You know, I think overall the field, of course, the Derby is always going to be the strongest race. But I do think the Derby is always going to be the strongest race because that is the #1 goal of the Triple Crown season. The top 3 or 4 horses in the Derby are usually going to be better than the top 2 or 3 horses in the Preakness. And then usually those middle horses in the Derby are going to be better than a couple of the middle horses in the Preakness. But some of the real long shots in the Preakness versus a couple of the long shots in the Derby, I don't really think there's really any difference. Mugatu did enter the Derby. He didn't get in because he wasn't also eligible. And then, you look at some of the other horses that were kind of long on Derby day. I'm not really sure. Catching Freedom was a top 4 favorite in the Derby. He comes back in here. A lot of people like Just Steel. He wheels back here in the Preakness. So overall, the Derby was a tougher field. And Mystik Dan, of course, riding the rail in that race, picking up the nice win just off that fast pace. Now, here's a horse that I'm kind of starting to like a little bit. I think he's playable in exacta wagers. And maybe if you want to go a little bit deeper in the pick 5 or pick 4 or doubles, Uncle Heavy is kind of interesting because he did win a stakes race at Parks. He's a closer. He ran down the speed in the Wither Stakes at 1.125 miles. But just the fact that he was able to run 1.125 miles in early February and overall the speed figure came back in 84. And then remember, he was not allowed to really work out because he was kind of quarantined before the Wood Memorial Stakes. But now he gets Irad Ortiz. If you noticed, he's got a workout on April 27th. He's got a workout on May the 4th. He's got a workout on May of the 11th. So I do think you can kind of make the case that Uncle Heavy is probably, in terms of long shots, I think he's at the same level as Mystik Dan was going into the Derby. Mystik Dan won the Southwest Stakes, and I think the Wither Stakes was comparable to the Southwest Stakes. And Uncle Heavy is going to be 15-1, and he gets Irad Ortiz. So I think you can make the case that Uncle Heavy is the type of horse that you kind of want to play. Maybe he's improving. He's only ran 5 times. He's got 3 wins. And so Uncle Heavy, to me, I'm kind of starting to see you can make the case for him as a horse that could be included as a price play in those trifectas. Now, Danny says that Muga is over his head. Some of the owners didn't even bet on him. That doesn't sound good. But, I think he's a closer. It's been a long time since he's got a win. I think he's probably going to be the longest shot on the board, and I think that's fair. Honor Maria is going to be going to the Belmont Stakes, Brian. So he's pointing to the Belmont Stakes. Of course, he was slammed out of the gate in the Kentucky Derby, started off dead last, passed some horses, ended up running in 8th place. So right now for the Belmont Stakes, we've got Sierra Leone. Looks like Fierceness is pointing to the Belmont, Honor Marie, and then we've got Antiquarian, who won the Peter Pan Stakes. So that's Uncle Heavy out of that post position, number 2. Of course, he's the Wither Stakes winner. He won the Wait for It Stakes, and he ran in the Wood Memorial. Uncle Heavy, probably right around 15-1. Now, remember, if you're new to the Triple Crown betting, the Preakness Stakes is that one race of the year where the odds make no sense. Like the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen horses that should have been 50 or 60-1, and they're 7 or 8-1 on Preakness Day. It does seem to be the weirdest day of betting in terms of win odds. But remember, the win odds don't reflect the debut double, the pick 4, and the pick 5 betting. So that means if a horse is 9-1 on the board, they might be 30-1 on the pick 3 or pick 4. So don't be afraid to play a long shot in some of these pick 3s, pick 4s, and pick 5s because the win odds are very strange. I'm not sure if they're just all there for the party, but some of the strangest odds have been seen the last couple of years in the Preakness Stakes. Now, Catching Freedom, this horse was basically the 4th favorite in the Kentucky Derby. and he ran okay. He ended up running fourth. Flavian Prat rode him in the Derby. He is going to ride him here in the Preakness Stakes. Now, Catching Freedom did win the Louisiana Derby. He had a 97 buyer in the Louisiana Derby, and he got a 97 buyer in the Preakness Stakes. So I would say he's pairing up his performances. He did improve from an 87 in the Smarty Jones to a 92 in the Risen Star. And then he sits there at about a 97. He's got good distance breeding. He was right behind Mystik Dan at the rail, running fourth in the Kentucky Derby. He does turn around on 2 weeks. I do think a smaller field is probably going to help Catching Freedom. He is a little bit more of a deeper closer when you look at his running style, so he'll definitely be coming off the pace. And Flavian Prat has been not as aggressive as I would like in some of these Triple Crown races the last couple of years, but Catching Freedom, I think, is going to be bet down to about 7-2 on Saturday. So Kurt, he is going with an exacta. He's going to go with Tuscan Gold, and he's also going to play Catching Freedom over Imagination. Going to play Imagination as the speed, running second. And a good point. Catching Freedom did beat Mystik Dan in January. And, with Mystik Dan, he did lose to some of these horses, and that's why he was 18-1 in the Derby. I think 18-1 was a fair price. He was basically 19-1. He was 18.61 odds. He was 12-1 in the Southwest Stakes on a muddy track. Now, they're saying it's going to rain, about 40% chance of rain on Saturday morning, and then maybe some rain early afternoon. So I will redoing the Preakness handicapping preview probably on Thursday, just because we got the scratch of Muth, chance of some rain moving in. So I kind of want to reevaluate it with some of the exacta possibilities. But, I don't want to handicap for slot because we don't really know how much it's going to rain yet. So Catching Freedom, I think, is a contender. It kind of just depends on if you think he can improve on the 14-day turnaround, or if he's kind of just in the middle of this form cycle where he's going to be between a 95 and 97 buyer speed figure. Now let's take a look. Pace of the race, I think before the scratch of Muth, I had the pace setter as Muth, and then I had Imagination sitting in second with a possibility of Seize the Gray. So now I'm seeing it as a couple of horses. Seize the Gray stretching out from a mile to a mile and 3/16. And then you've also got Imagination, who out of that 9th post position. Now, Imagination, we'll get to his past performances. He has ran 6 times. He's got 2 wins in 4 seconds. But all 6 races, he's been within 2 lengths at the second call. And he's had the lead 4 times in 5 races at the half-mile pole in a route race. So I just can't see how Imagination is not first or second at the 4 furlong mark into the race. So then it's a matter of how fast do you think the fractions are going to be? Do you think it's going to be 48 and change? Or do you think it's going to be more 47, more of an honest pace? One thing about Bob Baffert, he's pretty predictable. He likes to be on the lead in these big races. He likes to get out of the gate, and he likes to be that controlling speed. So Dwayne Lucas has also, in the past, kind of what I would call stolen some Triple Crown races by being on the front end. Oxbow was forwardly placed way back in the day, commendable, and the Belmont Stakes went wire to wire. Believe the fractions were like 114 and change. He was almost 25-1. So Dwayne Lucas is not afraid to go to the lead in these big stakes races because he knows the value of early speed. in these grade 1 races, especially with a lot of horses that have never really been on the lead in a grade 1 race. So whether, these grade 1 races, they're just always tough. I think people don't realize the difference between a grade 3 and a grade 2 to a grade 1. It's like AAA baseball versus the major leagues. These are the toughest races. And if you have grade 1 speed, you definitely want to use it in these type of races. So Stage Door Johnny says horses have form cycles. Definitely agree with that. And I think, maybe you could make the case that Mystik Dan, he ran third to Muth in the Arkansas Derby. He was behind Just Steel, but he seems to be improving. You got to remember, Mystik Dan only has 7 lifetime races versus Just Steel has 12 lifetime races. So that's why I think Just Steel really isn't improving. He might be able to win the Preakness, whereas Mystik Dan is probably holding form and right in the middle of a form cycle. Lou 13 says he's going to go with the Tri-Box 3589. Going to play the speed with imagination, Tuscan Gold, a little bit of Mystik Dan, and Catching Freedom. True Guru is going to go with 9738. He's leaning more with imagination on top. Big Dean says Mystik Dan for the Triple Crown. Of course, Mystik Dan probably benefits the most. I'm not so. Now, that's the thing. Do you think Mystik Dan benefits from the scratch of Muth? And here's my angle is Mystik Dan has been running well from off the pace. And there would have been more speed in the race with Muth. Now the pace might be softer. So does the scratch of Muth help Mystik Dan or hurt him? You could almost make the case that it kind of hurts Mystik Dan. So Nowhere Man says 8th. And we've got Siggy Mendoza, the venerable Siggy Mendoza. He picked Mystik Dan in the Kentucky Derby. He says in the Arkansas Derby, the race was over in the first turn for Mystik Dan because he was bumping. I believe it was Liberal Arts that might have bumped him early on in the Arkansas Derby. So that is true. He did close late. He was kind of out of it. He actually only passed Timberlake in the final couple strides to get third place. And interestingly enough, if he wouldn't have passed Timberlake right at the end, he might not even have gotten into the Kentucky Derby. So that just shows you like a 1 length difference in the final couple strides of the Arkansas Derby got Mystik Dan into the Kentucky Derby. So Jamie on Seize the Gray is a good match. I don't know if he can improve. I think Seize the Gray is what I like about him is he's stretching out. And again, 2 of my favorite angles in horse racing are horses stretching out or horses shortening up. I like horses shortening up on the cutback the most. But my second favorite angle is when they stretch out from 6 furlongs to a mile or a mile to a mile and 3/16. So Seize the Grays by Arrogate, who I think is a distance sire. And when we've had Jessica Tugwell on for our pedigree analysis, she thinks Arrogate is going to be a really good sire for routers. So I think Seize the Gray being by Arrogate out of Smart Strike, and Smart Strike is one of the better distance sires out there, has been a source. Now, I also think Seize the Gray could do very well on a sloppy track. A lot of people are going to move up Mystik Dan if it's sloppy or muddy on Saturday. But look at Seize the Gray. Seize the Gray has ran twice on a muddy and sloppy track. He won in the mud at Saratoga on a sloppy track at 17-1. And he beat Doorknock on a sloppy track. And at Saratoga, he was third on a muddy track. And there is a chance of some rain, and everybody's going to go running to Mystik Dan. But Danny, to your point, maybe Seize the Gray might like a sloppy, muddy track on Saturday. So if it is sloppy and I redo a video on Saturday, I may include him in some of the exactas. So that's one of the things when you're handicapping these races, you have to handicap the race because I think there's too much work to do if you wait until the morning of the race. But you do have to kind of put notes and circle and highlight things because sometimes the way the track is playing, the way the surface comes up, you do have to be flexible in your handicapping to start changing your mind on some of these horses. So Seize the Gray chased a fast pace in the Pat Day Mile. So yeah, even though some people think he came off the pace in the Pat Day Mile, what Siggy is saying is that they ran 44-3 and 109-2. And there's no way they're going to be running that fast on Saturday. So Seize the Gray may be actually near the lead in this race because the fractions are probably going to be 47-4 and maybe 112 for 6 furlongs. So I kind of agree with Siggy on there. The pace was a lot faster in the Pat Day Mile. Now, Robert says it looks like the track will be sloppy on Saturday. It could be muddy, could be sloppy. So there's the thing. It looks like it's a 40% chance of rain around 7 in the morning. Then it looks like we could have some rain around 9, 10 o'clock. And there could be a pop-up storm in the afternoon. So that means it could kind of get it wet. They could seal the track. But again, I will probably do a updated video if they seal that track on Saturday, because if it's a sealed track, then I probably do like Seize the Gray a little bit more. So those are just some handicapping factors you have to kind of make note. Early speed could pay off on a wet track. I don't know. Mystik Dan, he was a little bit closer to the pace in that Southwest Stakes. Didn't they hold Dan back to get the distance in the Arkansas? That's kind of what I thought. He was more forwardly placed in the Derby, but he was on the inside. So that's the key question with the Derby. Was it because he was on the inside and he saved ground, or maybe they kind of saved him a little bit from that Arkansas Derby? I do think I was kind of fooled from that Arkansas Derby. I thought they might have laid him back to get the distance, and maybe he can get the distance. I highlighted in yellow here that they've taken Mystik Dan off the pace in his last 3 races. And this is where he's run his best races. So now he did run good in the slop in the Southwest, but that was at 1 1/16. He did show speed at 12-1 in his debut at 6.5 furlongs. So what do you think? Do you think Mystik Dan can be more forwardly placed in the slop or a muddy track? Or his 3 best races are his last 3 races, and now he's better off just trying to save ground with Brian Hernandez? So give me some of your thoughts on Mystik Dan. But, you know, the Smarty Jones, he was beaten by Catching Freedom, and he had the lead in that race. So then they started to take him off the pace. And what's interesting is Catching Freedom, he was closer to the pace, and then they started taking him further back in the Risen Star and the Louisiana Derby. Maybe they send him a little bit closer to the pace for this race. So Mystik Dan was bothered at the start by Liberal Arts in the Arkansas Derby, according to Nowhere Man. And yeah, Mystik Dan did look good, kind of galloping in the slop. It's been sloppy the last couple of mornings in the Preakness Stakes. 14-day turnaround for Mystik Dan. So that's one thing to note. When you look at Mystik Dan, remember now, Ken McPeak did say that the short turnaround back on November 12th, if you look, he ran him 5.5 furlongs. Then on November 25th, on a 13-day turnaround, he ran 5th by 8 lengths at 1 mile. So that's the only race that he's ever ran on a short turnaround for Mystik Dan. Now remember, Mystik Dan did skip the Rebel Stakes because they wanted to have a fresh horse. And then they went to the Arkansas Derby. So do you think the short turnaround could maybe affect Mystik Dan in this race? Give me some of your thoughts on the turnaround for Mystik Dan. Now, Just Steel, this is a horse that I can't really make the case for because he's ran 12 times and Lucas really just kind of been throwing him into races. He ran in the Smarty Jones, he ran in the Southwest, he ran in the Rebel, he ran in the Arkansas Derby. Now he ran huge in the Arkansas Derby. He ran a big race in the Southwest. Now that was in a mud, so I do think he kind of maybe likes the mud. He did run third to Otto the Conqueror at Churchill Downs in the slop. So I think he's another horse who likes a slop, but he's ran 12 times. And if you notice, he has lost the last 4 races all at a distance. His last win was at 6.5 furlongs, and his only other win was at 6 furlongs at Saratoga. So he is 0 for 6 at a mile or longer for Just Steel. So I think that that's important when you look at a 1 3/16 race for Just Steel, especially with the short turnaround. So we'll have to determine how Just Steel improves or is kind of holding steady for the Preakness Stakes. Now you've got the 9-horse Imagination. He comes in, he could possibly be the speed of the race. And look at that, 6 times he's ran first or second every call. And he's been on the lead 4 or 5 races at the second call. He's been on the lead 3 times at the third call. This horse has got a lot of grit. He dug back against My Moon. He dug back against Stronghold, ran a big maiden race to get the win. He won the San Felipe. Now the small fields out of California, he did run in 2 5-horse fields and a 4-horse field. So he's facing an 8-horse field here in the Preakness. Imagination probably going to be right around 5-1. Now I picked Imagination, and I think I'm still going to stick with Imagination. I picked Imagination when Muth was in there. I liked him more because of the price. I thought he could be on the lead turning for the home. But now at 3-1, I'm not so sure I like him as much, but I like him a little bit more just because he could be the lone speed in the race for Imagination. Now here's a horse that's getting a lot of action, Tuscan Gold. He's by Medaglia d'Oro, who has only ran 3 times. He's trained by Chad Brown. Chad Brown has won 2 Preakness Stakes, Cloud Computing, and he also won a couple of years ago with a second Preakness starter, and he ran second last year with Blazing Sevens. Now, Tuscan Gold ran third in the Louisiana Derby to Catching Freedom. He had the 11th post position that day, so he came wide, kind of ran on after getting bumped a little bit at the top of the stretch. He's a horse who I think could move up on a muddy track with that Curlin pedigree. And Tyler Gaffleone has won 2 Preakness Stakes. He won with War of Will, and then he also won with Cloud Computing for trainer Chad Brown. So I think Tuscan Gold is pretty interesting. I think there's a lot of sharp handicappers that are picking Tuscan Gold in this race, just because if you notice, he's been working forwardly. Now, for a while, he was on the Kentucky Derby also eligible list. He was going to, but then they just decided they didn't think they could get in. So they were going to try to then just wait for the Preakness. So Tuscan Gold, lightly raced, big win at Gulfstream Park. And he ran in that Sierra Leone maiden race last year in November. So he did run once as a 2-year-old. So Chad Brown won with early voting. He won with Cloud Computing. And he was second in the Preakness last year with Blazing Sevens. So that's something to consider. So wheel your top horse over the field for the trifecta should pay well if you've got the right one. Yeah, I think that's a good strategy. You know, with only 8 horses, there's a lot less combinations. So I think you're going to have to key for a trifecta or key a horse first and second and only probably go about 2 deep on top. I think if you go any more, I think it's going to be hard to get more than $40 or $50 out of this trifecta unless you get one of these longer shots like Mugatu or Uncle Heavy or Seize the Gray in that second position. So I'm leaning more, I think the favorites look pretty strong in this spot. To me, Imagination, Mystik Dan, Tuscan Gold, and Catching Freedom, probably those four combined probably have about an 80% chance of winning this race. The only horse that I would really consider would be maybe be Uncle Heavy. And then if it's a sloppy track, I would probably move up Seize the Gray a little bit just because of the pedigree, and he's got some speed, and he could be a horse that you may want to consider just because he could move up at a price. And he did face 45 fractions and 109 in that Pat Day Mile a couple weeks ago. What do you think about a trifecta wheel 9 with all? If you only put one horse on top, I'm okay with that, because then basically you're making that a win bet, and I think that would pay more than a win bet. And then if you could get either Seize the Gray or Uncle Heavy second or third, I think you could get a nice little payout. If you're going to key Mystik Dan, I just don't think the trifecta is going to pay much. I think if you like Mystik Dan, you're better off doing a daily double, either a Black-Eyed Susan double or a double in the turf race before the Preakness. So True Guru, I think I like that bet if you're going to key 9 because he's the third favorite in the race. I have a feeling Catching Freedom could be the second favorite behind Mystik Dan. He's getting a lot of buzz. Maybe, I guess we'll see how it plays out. Mystik Dan, I do think will be favored. Catching Freedom, Imagination, and Tuscan Gold, kind of horses that could be in that thing. So who could set the pace? Do you really think anybody other than Imagination can set the pace in this race? Mystik Dan. Now, here's something that's interesting. His Beyer speed figure, he got a 100 Beyer. His Brisnet speed figure, I believe, was a 98. So Brisnet really did not give the Derby a big speed figure. And Mystik Dan did save a lot of ground. Now, one thing I noticed, I downloaded the raw data from Daily Racing Form, and the track variant for Derby Day was a 10, which means they had a pretty high track variant. A low track variant means the track was a little bit on the fast side. Now, we did see some of the horses run fast early on. The Pat Day Mile fractions were fast. Gun Pilot ran a 121, but on the raw speed chart, a 203 and change with the final quarter of 26. Mystik Dan, he ran a good Derby, but I don't think he ran a Derby where you want to take too short of a price in the Preakness Stakes. Now, Just Steel, he was off the board in the Kentucky Derby. He had the huge race in the Arkansas Derby. I don't know. I just don't think he can improve. He's ran 12 times. I'd rather have Uncle Heavy or Seize the Gray as a long shot than Just Steel. Seize the Gray, of course, maybe he shows some more speed in this race. Nowhere Man says Imagination likes to run second. He does have 4 seconds. So maybe you can back wheel a little bit with Nowhere Man. And, I looked for some post position stats for the Preakness and I was unable to find them, Danny. So I'm going to keep on looking and we'll add that to the video, but I did not see any post position stats for the Preakness over the years. Anthony says it's between Tuscan Gold, Chasing Freedom, and Mystik Dan in his trifecta. Now he's looking for the winner and going to try to parlay that one on top with a little bit deeper. So, yeah, I think if you go Mystik Dan on top, you got to get very skinny for second and third. And I don't think it's going to pay much. I think if you could get Catching Freedom or Imagination to win, and then you get one of those long shots, either Uncle Heavy or Seize the Gray or Mugatu or Just Steal third or second, that's where it could pay a little bit. Now, Seize the Gray coming out of that mile race, stretching back out to 1 mile and 3/16. I think the angle there is he could be showing some speed and solid distance pedigree with Smart Strike and Arrogate in that pedigree. So the field, once again, for the Preakness Stakes, you've got the scratch of Muth. You got Mugatu right around probably 15 to 1 now. True Guru found some stats. He has 6 with the most wins in the Preakness. There you go. Seize the Gray could be winning the Preakness out of that 6th post position. So you've got Uncle Heavy at 2, Catching Freedom, probably about 4 to 1, 7 to 2 now. Muth is scratched. Mystik Dan, probably about 8 to 5. Seize the Gray, about 10 to 1. Just Steal, I think, will be about 11 to 1. And remember, since this is the Preakness odds and everybody seems to be under 15 to 1, probably Tuscan Gold about 4 to 1. And then Imagination, probably right around 7 to 2 or 4 to 1. So Mugatu run well on a muddy track. Well, so far, Mugatu has never ran on a wet or muddy or sloppy track. He did run on the turf a few times. His best race, actually, he ran a couple of good synthetic races at Turfway Park. And his only win was on the dirt at Gulfstream Park. And that was a big field. He's a closer. He comes a little bit off the pace. So, Mugatu, I don't think moves up on a sloppy track, but he will save some ground. And he's right in there. His Bluegrass Stakes, he made a move to only be 5 lengths out at the 3rd call. I think going to Joe Bravo from Joe Talamo is probably an upgrade on a jockey switch side. I think Joe Bravo kind of probably an upgrade on the jockey side, along with Uncle Heavy getting Irad Ortiz. And there'll be no attempt to break Secretariat's Preakness record with these. Yeah, I think Preakness record for Secretariat is safe in this race. Kind of agree with Nowhere Man. Several could run 3rd place in this race. So I think you kind of have to pick and choose who could run 3rd. If you're doing a superfecta, I think if you go, kind of use the same horses that you're going to use for 3rd and 4th and then knock off 1 or 2 horses. I think you have to kind of toss 2 horses for that superfecta to kind of get it to pay. And you can do 10-cent superfectas in the Preakness, but I think you kind of got to play them for 40 or 50 cents to really have a chance to come away with a little bit of a price. So overall, when you look at some of the horses, I think, to me, the horses that could really spice up that trifecta for 3rd could be Uncle Heavy and Seize the Gray if it's a sloppy track or a muddy track, if we get some rain Saturday afternoon. Now, I do think Mystik Dan improves on a muddy, sloppy track. I don't think Just Steal really improves that much, but a little bit. Catching Freedom, he did win the Louisiana Derby coming from behind, but he ran 3rd in the Risen Star on a sloppy track, but that's his only sloppy track. You never really know. He did close. Could go either way with Catching Freedom. I would say it doesn't going to hurt him, but I'm not sure it's going to help him. Steve says Catching Freedom is your winner. Anthony says he's going to go 358 with 358 for your super. And Preakness Stakes. Now, there is going to be a bet where you can do the Black Eyed Susan with the Preakness. So the Black Eyed Susan is on Friday, and it's race number 13. It's kind of like the Kentucky Oaks, Kentucky Derby double. If you have a play in the Black Eyed Susan, leave a comment. My top pick is going to be Corposo. I like Corposo along with Recharge. And then I like Lemon Muffin. I think those are horses possibility of using in the Black Eyed Susan. So I'm going to be using Lemon Muffin. I'm going to use Corposo and then Recharge. And then for the Black Eyed Susan, I'm going to be using Imagination as my key horse. And then I'm going to choose a second horse. That's probably going to be depending on the weather. If it's sloppy, maybe Mystik Dan. If it's not sloppy, maybe Catching Freedom or Tuscan Gold. But I'll probably be redoing my Preakness video with Moose Scratched on Thursday. I may even wait till Friday just because we may have another scratch and we'll have a little bit better idea about the weather on Saturday. So that is a look. Anybody else have any picks for the Black Eyed Susan for a Black Eyed Susan Preakness double? Catching Freedom got the perfect setup last time. Pace this time will be more moderate. Yeah, I'm overall saying it's going to be a moderate pace to even maybe a slow pace. I'm projecting 112 and change for 6 furlongs. True Guru, he likes the muffin, Lemon Muffin in the winner in the Black Eyed Susan. Keith Asmussen off, and Lemon Muffin getting a new jockey for the Black Eyed Susan. And that could make the difference. Flavian Prat jumps aboard Lemon Muffin. And you know what? We ain't seen Muffin yet out of Lemon Muffin. And Lemon Muffin, of course, won the Honeybee as a maiden at 28-1. And the locals, Siggy Mendoza said for the Black Eyed Susan, normally you want to play inside. Traditionally, there's always been the tight turns of Pimlico and the inside speed. So maybe Jeannie Marie. Last year, we saw the speed hold at the rail with National Treasure get to that rail and scrape the paint down the stretch. So I do think those tight turns of Pimlico can favor the horse near the rail down the lane. But I do think you need to get to position going into the stretch. So John is going to load up on Tuscan Gold. He says Chad Brown is going to redeem his Derby loss. Of course, Chad Brown was second last year in the Preakness with Blazing Sevens. Now, who could ask for Mo? For Belmont gets blinkers on. And who could ask for Mo? Of course, he's been facing some good company. Ran against Power Squeeze in the Suncoast Stakes. Ran against Fiona's Magic in the Devona Dale. And ran kind of moderately in the Gazelle Stakes. Blinkers on, good pedigree. And another one with a jockey change with Louis Saez. He might try to get a little bit more speed out of Who Could Ask for Mo. Now, remember, we've got the Black Eyed Susans on Friday. We got the Preakness on Saturday. I will be doing a tip sheet, and this is going to be updated Saturday morning with scratches and weather changes. So my tip sheets I type up Saturday morning so you get the latest information. If you look in the description below, there is going to be a link to sign up for my free tip sheet. It's absolutely free. It gets you signed up for Belmont, Travers, all the big racing days. And I did do a tip sheet for the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks. So we're doing a tip sheet Saturday for the Preakness, all 14 races. And it will be updated on Saturday morning after the scratches to account for pace scenarios and then looking at the weather on Saturday morning. So Tyler Gaffleone for Nowhere Man, and we will see what happens for the Preakness Stakes. So that's going to do it. Thanks everybody for joining me tonight. Thanks for all of your questions. We'll probably be redoing my preview video just because of the scratch of Muth, maybe some other changes. Team Bitcoin, he is going with a 5-8 double. He's going to take Gunsong in the Black Eyed Susan and Tuscan Gold in the Preakness Stakes for his Black Eyed double. Nowhere Man says good luck to all, and we will recap it come Saturday, the Preakness 2024. And as Dwayne Lucas always says, people have opinions, horses have the facts.